Welcome to Zan Khan Live, where everything is discussed and nothing is censored. Today, talking with us about faith, science, and reason. Joining us from Vienna, a scientist, a philosopher, a paleontologist, a German paleontologist by the name of Dr. Gunter Beckley. Welcome to our show, Dr. Gunter Beckley. This is Zan Khan. It's a pleasure having you on Zan Khan Live.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Gunter, you're also part of the Discovery Institute, which is one of the most prominent think tanks regarding intelligent design, science, and philosophy. I wanted to talk to you about some deep questions regarding religion, science, philosophy, faith. And let's get to the first question. Do you think in the next 50, 100 years, 30 years, 40 years, can science ever replace religion?
Well, before I answer the question, one thing I have to say is you said I'm a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an armchair philosopher. So I'm a little bit self-taught in philosophy, but I'm not a professional philosopher. So my profession is paleontologist, but hopefully I can still contribute some thoughts about these issues. So can science ever replace religion? So first thing, of course, is that science is inherently limited to observing phenomena in space-time, regularities, patterns, and then making mathematical models and extending on these models with predictions and testing these predictions. So there is a certain area where there's no overlap. So unless religion makes claims that overlap with science, so that would be claims about the nature of physical reality, for example, questions of age of the earth. If religion doesn't make such claims, then there is no overlap, and then the two cannot conflict, and then science can never replace religion. Science can never answer these why questions that religion asks. Why are we here? What shall we do? How should we live? And these are all questions that do not fall in the realm of scientific inquiry. And of course, there is a little bit a strange trend in some realms where there is a try to use results from modern science and also from technology to reinterpret certain religious ideas. That would be, for example, in transhumanism, where we have this idea of the technological singularity that has also been mocked as the rapture for the nerds. Or there is this idea we could upload our minds and maybe get a kind of resurrection of the dead in cyberspace. So there is this kind of idea that science could maybe replace religion with some of these ideas, but these are, of course, very scientific ideas. I suppose most people wouldn't be very enchanted by the idea to be resurrected in cyberspace. So I think there will always be religion, and it will not be affected by scientific results unless there is this overlap. And of course, there's another thing which is important, and that is that modern science can even support religion, not replace religion, but support religion by, for one, showing that materialism is wrong, which is very much becoming mainstream in physics based on results from quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics.
Especially in quantum mechanics, where there have been all these results, not just the double slit experiment, but violation of certain inequalities, Bell's inequality, Leggett's inequality, which basically show that this idea of naive realism, that there is a real physical reality out there that is independent from observation and has definitive values prior to measurement. This has been refuted by science, and there is even more. There are certain scientific results that can support philosophical arguments that would lead to the God hypothesis. So most people will have heard about these first cause arguments from the Big Bang or the fine-tuning arguments. But if we should have time, I could present a much more modern and much less well-known argument for God, which is based on the growing consensus in modern physics that space-time is not fundamental, but is emergent, and that it is emergent from quantum information, entanglement of quantum information. And the other part of the argument is the currently most debated and most recognized naturalistic approach to the question of consciousness, and that would be Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory. And the argument goes like this. Premise one would be space-time is emergent and it emerges from entangled quantum information. The premise two would be entanglement of information is the same as integration of information. That has been shown mathematically. Premise three would be integration of information is what consciousness is. That is the core of Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory. And it's not just a weird claim, it has a theorem and it has made predictions that have been empirically verified in brain research. And so the conclusion would be space-time emerges, it emerges from entangled information is integrated information is consciousness, that space-time emerges from consciousness. And because there's a wave function of the universe, there's an integrated information state of the whole universe. So the final conclusion would be the universe emerges from a universal consciousness, which is what most people would call God. So science can not only very probably not replace religion, but it can actually inform religion and support religion.
Dr. Gunter, you being extremely humble, clarifying that you're not a philosopher, but a paleontologist. All of us that watch your shows and read your stuff know that you're a paleontologist, but I've been doing this work for the past 8 years. I've been interviewing people on these subjects. And, you know, to be very honest, your grip on philosophy is much better than many professors I know. So I really respect you for being humble.
Thank you.
But I have to give you credit where it's due. I want to get to the next question, Dr. Gunter. In your opinion, are scientific and religious explanations philosophically incompatible, as some say?
That depends. That depends on this question, which I already alluded to. That is, do they make overlapping claims? So, for example, religion mostly makes claims that do not overlap with science. So, for example, theological musings about the Trinity or miracle claims, historical miracle claims, these are not in the realm of science. And so there cannot be an incompatibility because there's no overlap in the claims that the two areas make. In those few cases where there are overlapping claims, so that would be, for example, in this issue in the of the age of the Earth, where you have these, let's say, religious motivated young Earth creationists who will say, well, the Earth, based on the claims of the Old Testament, of the book of Genesis, is only 5,000 years old. And a lot of evidence from science would say, well, the universe is about 14 billion years old and the Earth about 4.5 billion years old. There, of course, you have a conflict. And then you have to decide, do you rather go with science or do you rather side with your favorite holy book, or do you reinterpret either your interpretation of religious revelation or do you reinterpret certain scientific ideas? So in those cases, you could have an incompatibility, which then requires you to make up your mind about these questions.
Now, getting to the next question, as you rightly said, many neo-atheists, they say, the New Age atheists, they claim that philosophy is dead. It's irrelevant. How do you look at their claim? Do you think philosophy is dead?
No, obviously not. And the funny thing is these claims have been made by people like Jerry Coyne or by Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, or by Richard Dawkins.
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris, or even by Stephen Hawking in his book, The Grand Design, where he said philosophy is dead. And the funny thing is that all these people in their books in which they say that philosophy is dead, spend a lot of pages in the exercise of doing philosophy. For example, when Richard Dawkins uses the argument from evil against belief in God, then this is, of course, not science. That is a philosophical argument. So even those people contradict their own claim that philosophy is relevant, because they use philosophy a lot. And actually, I've heard by somebody who knows Stephen Hawking or knew Stephen Hawking personally, that this was a deliberate provocation by Hawking, and he was very well aware. He was not so stupid that he wasn't aware that he was doing philosophy himself, but he knew that his books are selling better when he just bluntly says, God doesn't exist, philosophy is dead. So there's also a little bit of marketing in these claims. But of course, apart from these issues, philosophy will always be relevant. And the reason is that philosophy is at the very heart and at the base of science, in the question, what is science at all? How do we do science? What is the scientific method? How do we distinguish science from non-science? How do we decide between competing hypotheses or criteria like parsimony? That's all not coming from science, but from philosophy of science. So philosophy will always be relevant for science. And it's also relevant in science, not just for the scientific enterprise in general, but even in science, there are often these questions of how should we interpret certain scientific results. So for example, in quantum mechanics, we have, I think, something like a dozen or more interpretations of quantum mechanics. And a lot of these interpretations also involve philosophical criteria or questions of the philosophy of time and space. In this question, is space-time something that exists as a substance, or is it relational? Would say space-time disappear if there would be no objects in space-time? These are philosophical questions. So philosophy will never disappear and is far from dead.
Dr. Gunter, let's get to the last question. And we hear a lot about the word consciousness. How does consciousness inform the science and religion debate?
Yes, I think it informs it quite a lot. And the most obvious point, of course, is something that has been named by an Australian philosopher who is one of the specialists on the philosophy of mind and of consciousness, David Chalmers, who has created this term, the hard problem of consciousness. So this would be to distinguish from the soft or easy problem of consciousness. That would be just how does the brain compute certain stuff. But the hard problem of consciousness, how do you get from matter in motion, from particles, to this inner experience of qualia, of feeling, seeing the color red, tasting the taste of wine. And that is something where it strongly looks like that it's not just a gap of science that we don't know enough and then give us 100 more years and then science could explain how matter could create consciousness. It is in principle not possible, because science always has this kind of third-person approach. You look at stuff and then you explore it and study it from the third-person perspective. But consciousness, what we mean by consciousness, is a first-person experience. Unless you have experienced what it means to see the color red, if you have never seen it, you can study as much physics and as much brain physiology as you want. You will never know what it means to see red unless you have seen it. So that's the reason why I think that this issue of consciousness shows that at least this very rough scientific materialism has problems and is wrong, because it cannot explain our most obvious experience of consciousness. And you can also make an argument from consciousness based on this fact that consciousness cannot be explained by matter in motion. So we cannot doubt that consciousness exists. That would be based, for example, on Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So that is obvious that consciousness exists. We have quite good arguments that we cannot explain consciousness with matter in motion. And we also have quite good philosophical arguments that dualism, that would be these Cartesian ideas that you have these two totally separate realms of mind and matter, that this cannot be true, because then you have this interaction problem that you have two realms, and if they don't intersect, then how should they interact? You have this kind of explanatory gap between these two realms. And if they should intersect, then they collapse into the same. So if mind-body dualism is false, then we ultimately are left just with that mind is all that exists, and that matter is an epiphenomenon, because otherwise we couldn't explain the existence of mind and of consciousness. So I think there's a lot of to gain from the philosophy of mind and thinking about the phenomenon of consciousness, not only for science, but also for religion or spirituality.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunter Beckley, for being on ZanCon Live and talking with us regarding faith, reason, and science. It was a pleasure having you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
This was Dr. Gunter Beckley discussing faith, science, and reason, and also some deep questions regarding religion and science. Until the next episode of ZanCon Live, keep on watching ZanCon Live. This is Zan Khan. Take care and goodbye.